Well, welcome everyone to our latest edition of the Meet the Author series. My name is Nathan Alexander, and I'm the project manager with the Non-Religion in a Complex Future project. So in this webinar, we'll be hearing from Ryan Cragun and Jesse Smith, and they'll be talking about their new book, hot off the presses, Goodbye Religion, The Causes and Consequences of Secularization, published by NYU Press just this month. Ryan Cragun is professor of empirical sociology at the University of Tampa. His research focuses on the nonreligious and Mormonism and has been published in various scholarly journals. He's also the author of several books. Jesse Smith is associate professor of sociology at Western Michigan University. His research is centered on secularity, social deviance, and self and identity. He has published in a variety of scholarly journals and is co-author and co-editor of two books. So, well, first we'll have the presentation by the authors, and then the remainder of the time will be for Q&A. So I'll turn it over to Ryan and Jesse.
Thanks, Nathan. Okay, so is that working to share up? Excellent. I'm kind of surprised at the turnout, but I'm wondering how many of you are here just to see if I can actually present, because there is a hurricane bearing down on me, and we're fine. So, and Jesse and I have worked this out that if my power goes out or my internet goes out, Jesse will pick right up and he'll just kind of run us through it. So we should be okay. But thanks everybody for coming. We're going to keep this relatively short, so we have plenty of time for Q&A. But yeah, so Nathan introduced kind of the book. Let's jump into it. I'll give a little bit of background, some of the details, then Jesse's going to take over about halfway through and finish us out. So what are we doing? What's going on? Most of us are aware at this point that lots of, and the book is US focused, so I should mention at the beginning, but lots of Americans have been leaving religion. We're up to roughly 30% say they have no religious affiliation these days. And what we're focused on in the book is why is this happening? So why are so many people leaving religion? What does it look like to leave? All right. So that's another big part of the book, is what is the actual process? We've got a lot of chapters on that. And then kind of what are the social, psychological, and environmental conditions that are underlying this massive exiting out of religion? So these are some of the major questions that we have throughout the book. I'm going to talk briefly about the methods and a couple of other things, then I'm going to turn it over to Jesse. So methodologically, we're drawing on two primary sources here. So it is a mixed methods project, and we think that actually strengthens the project pretty substantially. So we use primarily general social survey data for the US, but we also supplement that with world values survey because they have some questions that the GSS doesn't. All of it, again, focused on the US. And then we have a couple of other nationally representative surveys that we use to compare generally three groups throughout the book. People who were raised religious but have left. That's our primary group of interest, as religious exiters. We also talk about those who have never been religious, and we compare them. So there's a lot of comparisons between these two. And of course, we want to compare them with those who have stayed religious or joined religion. So ultimately, it's a comparison between those three groups for most of the topics that we cover in the book. Not exclusively. The World Value Survey doesn't actually have that information, so we use a slightly different comparison. We also combine this with a lot of qualitative data. So we have 120 in-depth interviews. Jesse did most of those. So I did, I think, about 20 of them. Jesse did about 100 of the interviews. They started back around 2008-ish and then run all the way up until just about today. On top of those interviews, we actually have hundreds of hours of field work, observation, and informal interviews that we conducted. And all of that is informing the book, though mostly what you'll see in terms of qualitative data in the book is just quotes from the interviews that Jesse did an amazing job analyzing. Just to kind of lay out kind of big picture, why are we interested in this? Why are we looking at this topic? This next slide, and I'll explain it a little bit. I won't go into too much detail. This next slide kind of lays out what's going on here. So this is one of the figures from the book. It's early on in the book, and it's just showing kind of trends over time. So we can see those three groups that we're comparing. The exiters, that's the thick black line towards the bottom there. The never religious, which is, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but down here. So it's this kind of dotted line that's a little bit smaller, and then those who stayed or joined. And part of the reason why I want to just take a second to explain this is averaging those numbers by decade. So we could have done like moving averages over time. We could have done a variety of different things, but for a lot of our analyses, we thought it made more sense to just do averages by decade. It's a bit more conservative, right? So if we were to look all the way at the extreme in 2021, when our data collection ended, we didn't have more recent waves when we were working on this. This number would actually be higher, but it's the average for that entire decade, basically. And we did that just to kind of drop out the year-by-year fluctuations in the data, so you don't have peaks here and there. Those peaks aren't all that informative, so it's really kind of underestimating some of the trends, but we can clearly see that those who have left religion, they started around 5% in the 1970s, they're up to about 16.5% of the population in the 2010s, basically. It's higher than that now, but that's roughly what it is if we go by decades. Those who were never religious, so they were not raised religious, they've stayed not religious, there was less than 1% back in the 1970s. Today, that's up to about 6%, again, for that entire decade. And obviously, as those grow, the religious has to shrink. So we can see that in here. There's clearly a trend happening. We want to try and explain that. That's the primary focus of the book. We're going to talk about just a couple of things today. So we're going to start in a discussion of demographics. We won't go too deep into this, but we're going to focus a little bit on the demographic arguments. We're going to talk about that. We're going to then turn to our framework. Jesse will take over when we get to that point. So we'll talk a little bit about our theoretical framework and then kind of the what comes after religion question. So we'll come back to that towards the end with a final point, which is our metaphor. Pay attention to those pictures on the side. I don't know if anybody's noticed the pictures of people kind of jumping. There's a reason why that's there, and Jesse will explain that at the end. Okay, so we're going to turn to demographics and just talk about the demographic shifts that we've seen over time. So part of the reason why we're interested in this, and this is intentionally a blank slide, is it used to be the case back in the 1970s and 80s when people started to pay a little bit of attention to people who are not religious. There were a lot of claims about people who are leaving religion or the non-religious being kind of exclusively some specific demographic. It was mostly kind of younger, white, highly educated, affluent men were the ones that like, oh, they're the ones who are particularly likely to leave religion. So we tackle that. We think that's an important question. We want to see what's actually going on. So the second chapter in our book really spends a lot of time on demographics and looks to see how well do demographics actually improve our ability to predict who's going to leave religion and who's not. And was that kind of generalization, if you will, about it being particularly young white men, highly educated, affluent men, was that actually true, or has something shifted, or is it still true? So I'm going to turn to a couple of figures from the book, and we'll just kind of walk through this, and then we're going to turn it over to Jesse. So this one is the average age of religious exiters over time. So exiters, the never religious, and religious over time. And sure enough, if we look back in time to the 1970s, exiters and the never religious were substantially younger than the religious. Okay, now all three groups have shifted over time. Our population here in the US is aging. This is true of a lot of developed countries. But what you can't, I mean, you can see it, it's a little hard to see, but this gap has been changing and shrinking over that entire time period. So yes, it is still the case, but it was definitely the case that, you know, exiters and the never religious were almost 10 years younger on average back in the 1970s. By roughly today, that has dropped. So the gap is much narrower, at least for exiters. So it's about a 6-year gap, 7-year gap, something like that. But all of them are getting a little bit older. The gap has shifted. But this is one area where we still do see a bit of a demographic difference between those who have left religion or were never religious and the religious. Religious individuals tend to be a bit older. Next one, so this is again just kind of demographics, is this one, and this one has to do with the percentage of exiters who are white. So the General Social Survey, it has more nuance in terms of ethnicity, but as far as race goes, it really just has 3 categories: white, black, and other. And if you look, going back again to the 1970s, and this is where we think things are a little bit weird, right? This kind of generalization that exiters were particularly likely to be white men, that was actually never really entirely the case. The racial composition of the United States has shifted over time, so that's a big part of what's driving this trend. But exiters were never exclusively white. Were they more likely to be white back in the 1970s? Oh, a little bit, right? But on all of these, this hasn't changed that much, but it's dropped for all of them in part because the racial makeup of the United States has shifted, but the gaps have also shrunk again, right? So we're not seeing as big of a gap. Basically, the demographics, like this distinction is not particularly important. And in fact, I'll talk about this again, probably again at the end of my section. If you look at the modeling, the ability to predict whether somebody was going to leave religion or not based on race, even back in the 1970s, was virtually negligible. It wasn't a particularly useful predictor of determining who was going to leave and who wasn't. Next one is gender. So here we go. This is gender. We have more in the book. We're just kind of pulling out some of the standard ones. Again, there's this generalization, if you will. Back in the 1970s, it was particularly likely to be men who were leaving, right? So this is the percentage male. And yeah, that was kind of true, right? There was a bigger gap, but it's not like it was exclusively male. It was still almost 40% of the people who were leaving were female. That has shifted, and this gap has shrunk over time to where today, as in the early 2010s, we're down to about a 53 versus 42%. So the gap has shrunk. It's not exclusively male. It never was, but it's definitely not that male as it used to be. So on all of these measures, when we're looking at the demographics, basically the argument that we make in the book is they were overstated 50 years ago, right? The gaps were never huge. There were some differences, but they weren't that big. And all of those gaps have shrunk. And then at the very end of that chapter, we actually build kind of a big, complicated statistical mixed effects model. And we show that demographics really don't account for the vast majority of variation in people who are leaving religion. They're just not that predictive, right? And that's kind of what I'm wrapping up with here. Age, race, gender, and other status characteristics are even less predictive today than they were 50 years ago, but even back then, they were not that useful in terms of helping us understand who is going to leave religion. Which leads us to make, and I'll qualify this very quickly, right? But it leads us to make this claim that today, everyone's leaving, right? Now, we don't actually mean that everyone's leaving. What we mean is demographically, the characteristics aren't useful in helping us to predict who is going to leave. It's all demographic groups are actually almost equally likely to leave religion. So it's not really useful to focus on demographics anymore. That's one of the first things that we talk about. So obviously not everyone is leaving, but it could be anyone is really what we could say here. So that's kind of the gist of that first chapter. We obviously talk about the other factors that are leading to this. And that, of course, is going to lead us to Jesse's topic. But the point that we're making now, and this is, it makes sense just kind of mathematically, right? As religious exters become a larger percentage of the population, they have to mathematically look like the rest of the population. As a result, the demographic characteristics that made them somewhat unique in the past are shrinking. Now they look like everybody else. At that point, I'm going to stop my share, and Jesse is going to take over, and he will pick up on the theory that we use throughout the book. So hopefully Jesse is ready.
Yes, thanks, Ryan. Excellent. Yeah, I think it's really important to set up the the demographic kind of conditions before we talk about our theory and what's going on here in terms of explaining why people are leaving. Right. So yes. So theoretically, we borrow this push-pull framework. We borrow this from migration studies. Demographers talk about the kind of the aspects of a resident country that are pushing people out of that country. Right. Crime, disease, lack of economic opportunity, war, etc. Right. And they also study the ways in which the target country is pulling people toward that country, right? So better educational opportunities, better economic opportunities, maybe a better social safety net, lower crime rates, etc. And it turns out as we worked through this that this ended up being a pretty good analog for explaining what is going on in terms of religious exiting. Right. So this is kind of one of the main theoretical backdrops of the book. We have a number of other things going on here too. We've got 2 or 3 different typologies and such that kind of interlink with this push-pull framework. But in the interest of time, I'll focus just on these. We won't get into that, and happy to answer any questions people have about some of those other theoretical elements. Okay, so here is a list of some of the push factors, right, that are pushing people out of religion. But we want to, and we point this out in the book, we want first to suggest that it's the case that for many people, they're just slowly drifting out of religion, right? It's this gradual process. It's not really this may not be any one push factor, right, specifically that's drawing individuals out, right? So why focus on these push factors, one might ask. And our response there is that just because many people are sort of gradually drifting out of religion doesn't mean that they don't have reasons for their secularization. So they will also appeal to many of these kinds of explanations as to why they left religion. And moreover, this sort of underscores one of the primary arguments that we make in the book, and that is that the context has changed. Ryan referred to some of this earlier in talking about the demographic makeup of the country, the lessening of the social stigma associated with not being religious. So just on a macro level, things have changed, right? So it's a combination of these kind of individual social and psychological kind of push factors in the context of this wider backdrop of these more macro level kinds of changes. So here's a sampling of some of the things that we discuss in the book. Morality. Many people find themselves out of alignment with the moral teachings of many, especially institutional religions, right? We offer a number of different graphs on specific topics. I've got a couple of them here, right? Questions about, views on homosexuality, for instance. Here I've got one, belief in hell. You can see these important differences between these three comparison groups that we use throughout the book. This is wrapped up in various political push factors, right? So on issues of gay marriage, LGBTQ rights, abortion, other kinds of social and political factors. Again, we frame this in kind of a value misalignment discussion, right? Our religious exiters are increasingly finding themselves sort of, out of step, or rather them thinking the religions are out of step with their moral and political beliefs. So this misalignment is again pushing people out of those religious institutions. Doctrines and dogmas. Again, we just shown a couple here, but we spent several pages with a lot of different tables showing these important differences across these three groups. It really is the case that people find the specific religious doctrines and dogmas and important, right, in terms of why they have left. We don't downplay the role of belief, right, and of the religious claims that religions make. Simultaneously, and this comes towards more the end of the book, we talk about the social networks, changing social networks that our religious exiters find themselves in, right? Having, at least one friend, right, who is non-religious has an effect, right, on the psychology of the person who themselves might be leaving. So it's not all just about having a doctrinal disagreements with religions. We're not saying that. It's both things, right, at the same time. But I have a slide here next where I'll show the relevance of the religious teachings of religions that are pushing people out. Hypocrisy. This was kind of a fun one. Actually, this came up repeatedly in the interview data. Here's one quote from Liv, a former Catholic, that I think is illustrative. She talked about the people in the congregation acting holier than thou, right? She got to know people more, right? Finding out that they're having affairs and they're cheating and they're being dishonest in a variety of ways, not just people in the pews, right? But people that occupy important positions, right, in their churches and their congregations. Interestingly, we had a few people that even talked about their discomfort with their own hypocrisy, right? Going to confession and doing all the things making, at least presenting themselves as believing in the religious teachings of the church, but then not following through, right? Not being consistent, and people would grow sort of weary of their own perceived hypocrisy being a part of the church. So that, again, this is another thing that's going to be pushing people out. Here's from Pew. This is a bit outdated now. This is about 15 years old, but I suspect that this hasn't probably changed in any dramatic way, right? So this is from Pew's Faith in Flux study showing the importance. I mean, we're approaching 40%, right, on religious teachings as being one of the primary reasons that people select in explaining why they have left religion. Are there positive things, beneficial things about leaving religion? According to our exers, the answer is yes, right? So these are pull factors, right? These are kind of the things that are attracting people, not just being pushed out of religion, but attracting people toward a more secular life and worldview. Right. So here's again another sampling of a few of the things that we talk about, better things to do. We don't use this. We're not trying to be flippant here. This is really what emerged out of the data, right? People literally just suggesting that they wanted to use their time in a different way. Ordinary, sort of normal things. They want to spend a little more time with family, maybe do a little extra work on Sundays or whenever they happen to maybe do practice religious services, right? A little bit more reading. We have a long list. I don't know how many, it's dozens of different activities that we poll. This comes from the American Time Use survey. It had very detailed information about, what people are actually doing with their time. I'll mention this here in just a moment with another slide. Autonomy, right? The desire for intellectual and personal autonomy, right? To be able to kind of make their own decisions, choices about those, the moral teachings, right, that they've come out of misalignment with, and the freedom to be able to develop their own set of beliefs and ideas about the way the world works as they, kind of develop more of a secular life stance. A modern worldview. Glenn here was a good example of this. He talks about how he just became increasingly frustrated with the biblical, in his case, literal biblical teachings that he grew up with. He began to really question authority, beginning with the authority of his father, who was a devout Christian and a preacher in his church. And so he talks about this questioning process and how after he came through that, right, just it opened up this space where he was able to accept, modern scientific perspectives, theories about the way the world is, from things, regarding human evolution, the age of the earth, origins of the cosmos, those kinds of things. So the attractiveness of a modern worldview, we argue, is something that is likewise pulling people toward secularity. I'm going to speed up just a little bit here so we don't spend too much time. So as I mentioned, as Ryan alluded a little bit earlier, so what is it they're up to? What do they do post-religion? Well, religious leaders, and even in the culture at large, I think in America, people tend to paint a pretty bleak picture about what it might mean when people leave religion, right? People are going to spend more time engaging in immoral behavior or taking drugs or having promiscuous sex or whatever, right? This is an assumption that many people hold, that they think this could be catastrophic, right, for society if more and more people leave religion. What Ryan and I found, again, from the ATA survey and from other data sources we're pulling from here, it's really a rather ordinary, kind of even boring picture, right? They spend a little more time with family, they sleep in a little bit more, they watch TV, they shop, they play games with their kids. One thing we thought was interesting, we did highlight this briefly. They have, on average, if you do the math, about 36 seconds, the non-religious, 36 seconds having more sex, spending time having sex than the non-religious, again, comparing these three comparison groups throughout hopefully any one individual is spending maybe a little bit more than 36, or what was it, Ryan? I think 54 seconds. It was like 0.9 minutes.
Yeah, it was less than a minute.
54 seconds having engaging in intimate activities. Okay, so they develop non-religious life stances and worldviews. We have a long chapter that lays this out in a lot of detail, the ways that they go about constructing a non-religious life stance. But again, there's nothing too crazy or too sexy here. They live ordinary lives. They go on just doing the things that they'd be doing, anyway. They just have a little more time to do it now that they're not involved in religion. Okay, so as Ryan mentioned, what's with all the people flying through the air? Well, we offer in the conclusion a useful metaphor, a cliff diving metaphor. And I have to give credit to Ryan here. We kind of hashed this out, but this was primarily his idea, and I really liked it. I thought it was useful. So here's a lovely AI generated, I think so, Ryan. I think this was maybe a Chat GPT product.
Yeah.
So here's our metaphor, right? We've got this pool of water at the bottom of some of these very high cliffs, right? The water here for us represents secularity, a life without religion across many of the factors that we didn't even have time to talk about here. We talk about beliefs and behaviors and identities, but just the range of different religious activities that people are involved in. So this is secularity, a life without religion. The lower cliffs, where some people are standing on, represent very low cost kinds of religions, right? They're not that far away from just a modern secular sort of perspective anyway, right? You can think Episcopalian or something like that. Some have slides, and we don't have slides represented in here, but some have slides basically going right into the water, right? Unitarians, maybe. Unitarian Universalists would be a good example. But then in other cases, you've got people at the very tops of these cliffs, right? You got the Amish, Pentecostals, maybe in some versions of Mormonism, where it's very challenging, right? It's difficult and it's scary, and it takes a lot of courage to dive all the way from some of these cliffs. And then you've got everything in between, right? But the general point we're making here is that as more and more people enter this pool of water, the water level is slowly rising, right? And so you can see where we're headed with this, right? As all the demographic changes continue to unfold, as more and more people leave religion across various groups, it's not any one particular group, the water here level continues to rise. It becomes easier for people to jump, and it becomes less scary, right? Less difficult. They can actually see the water below them. They see that the water's pretty comfortable, right? It feels all right. It's not terrible, or there's nothing really scary about it. And so this encourages this change over time towards secularization. So we argue throughout the book that well, it's said in the title, right? Both the causes and consequences of secularization. But this is sort of our very simple, oversimplified description of that process of change. Okay, I'll leave it there. That's it for me too.
All right, great. Thanks so much, Ryan and Jesse. That was a great presentation. So we'll open the floor to questions. Either raise your hand on Zoom, or if you want to write your question in the chat, I can read it as well. Peter, and then Mehmet.
Unmute myself. Thanks. That's a very interesting presentation. I really like that metaphor and can think of all sorts of extensions of it. Mind you, that's always dangerous to try to push it too far, but still, I can think about the kinds of things about how the water is rising and what's eroding the cliffs and stuff like that. One of the things that certainly the research I've been involved in that keeps on coming around, and that comes up especially in other work like that of Vos and Chaves, is that this decline is largely generational. In other words, that there's far more loss, as it were, or exiting, if you like, that happens in the process of socialization, especially in the teen years. Then there is change once people reach adulthood. There is, of course, there's some there too. So I'm wondering in your book whether you discuss this generational factor and if you do, how you integrate it into your overall analysis.
I'm going to let Ryan take that, but the short answer is yes. We have a whole section on generational change in chapter 3 that we completely blew past. So Ryan, you want to say something?
Yeah. Thanks, Peter. That's a great point. So Jesse did hit it. We actually put it under a pull factor, right? Because we're combining it in some sense with autonomy and modern worldviews. But we do have a sizable section. We argue that this is probably the leading kind of contributor to the mechanism that leads to this is that generational change. But we do see it as something of a pull factor because we talk about parents are giving their kids more autonomy. So as kids have autonomy, if they have the decision, like they get to decide whether they're going to go to church or stay home and play video games, right? Like this is kind of a no-brainer for most kids these days. So once you grant them autonomy, then we start to see these shifts, these generational shifts. And Jesse has really great interview data showing this with some specific scenarios where there's like one woman who has like 3 generations of her family, and she talks about like her grandparents were really religious, her parents were less so, then she's not as religious, and then her kid's an atheist, and they like are actually having these conversations and just seeing generationally how this happens. But we actually pull out GSS data and show every successive generation and how all of those generations are basically less religious than previous ones. And we put it in as a pull factor. Could it arguably be a combination of the two, push and pull factors? Potentially, but we thought it made more sense to put it in as a pull factor. But it's a great point. We do think that this is probably one of the key mechanisms that's driving secularization. So yeah, great question, Peter. Thank you.
All right, Mehmet, and then Abby, Barathi, and then I see a whole bunch of questions in the chat as well.
Thank you for that presentation, and I'm very glad that I attended that presentation because I'm kind of looking kind of similar things in my thesis, and I'm about to wrap up my PhD dissertation. And actually, my thing was also close to what Peter Beer said. I also look at the socialization, and I want to ask, like, what was the role of family when you mentioned about this pull and push factors, and like the morality, religious teachings, and hypocrisy? They were the kind of I also identified in my own data based on the Turkish, like Muslim families from Turkey. And also, I want to ask whether have you seen like any other things like fear-driven religion or worldly injustice or the pressure from the family and friends, like the bad experiences the kids they had either like their early childhood socialization or later in their with the adolescence or the youth period or university period, which push them away from religion or pull them for the non-religion. So is there other factors as well, or those was the main things that you mentioned in your presentation?
Yeah, that's a great question. On the family stuff, again, we have another whole section outlining the socialization component, right? So we talk about religious socialization, what that looks like, how early religious socialization especially will profoundly affect not just the probability of religious exit on the other end, but the nature of that religious exit, whether people have kind of a hard break and don't go quietly, or whether they, again, just sort of slowly drift away. The family stuff is very complicated. So speaking to the interview data specifically, it can kind of go in both directions, right? We had some people that became very disillusioned. One of them, Glenn, who I had up there, he had a very interesting story, very kind of a traumatic experience, right? Early on, came from a long line of family members being involved in a particular Christian fundamentalist group. And he was one of those like had a hard break, right? So the family thing was really a source of tension and conflict that pushed him out, right? And it took him decades. He finally has kind of a working relationship with his father, but it's not great, right? They continue to pray for him. Glenn also happens to be gay. He was kicked out of his house when he was 14. His father offered the scripture. I forget the exact quote now, but it's about, depart from me, ye sinner, right?
Yeah, it's bad.
And it was bad, right? So there's that kind of family stuff, right? But then on the other end of this, I alluded to this earlier, right? Having even one family member that has maybe drifted away from religion, and having another family member see that, it wasn't catastrophic, it wasn't that big of a deal, kind of opens this space for people to explore a little bit, right? Well, maybe that encourages a little bit more questioning or critique of what they were socialized to with respect to religious teachings. Such. You got some other good questions kind of buried in there, but that's the two kind of, yeah, the family stuff is complicated. It's the answer is a little bit of everything, right? Yeah, Ryan, was there anything to add there?
I'll clarify one thing that I think is kind of fun, and neither Jesse or I actually get full credit for this. So in the slides, there was one on the pull factor, which is the all offense, no defense. And this actually is a slightly different metaphor that comes from a good friend of mine, Rick Phillips, that he talks about. If you're religious and then like you switch and leave and join another religion, you're always kind of defending your own particular religious views. So anybody can critique them because they don't necessarily align with a modern worldview. And the argument that Rick gave is that if you leave religion and don't have religious views, then effectively, right? So if we're thinking about the religious people, they have like a sword, they can attack other people, but they have a shield because they have to defend, right? So they're like, oh, I'm going to attack your religion. I don't think you're right, but I have to defend my own religion. And Rick's metaphor is actually the people who leave and don't have religious views, they just have two swords. They're just on attack all the time because what are you really going to critique about them if they don't have these supernatural beliefs that they have to try and defend? So it's another pull factor, right? The appeal of not having to defend your particular supernatural beliefs is actually quite appealing to some people because they're like, now I don't actually have to defend anything. I'm just siding with stuff that's, clearly like observable, it's demonstrable. It's another useful little metaphor that's in the book that I thought was kind of fun, but I thought Jesse did a good job of answering the rest of the question. Lots of other questions popping up. Nathan, guide
Yeah.
us around here.
Yeah. I think I'll read two questions and then we'll
Okay.
we'll go to Abby. Just yeah, because I see we have a ton of questions, so hopefully we can try
Yeah.
and get to everyone. Okay. First question from Angela Garcia. Is the increase in exiters an increase in the number of people who exit each decade, or the total amount of people who exited in the population, e.g., including those from previous decades?
Yeah, so I can take that one really quick. It's actually the second. So it's the total amount of people who have exited. Now, of course, we're going to get people dying, right, in each wave of the general social survey. So there won't be a perfect accumulation, but it's basically not per decade, like this is how many people left, but it's an accumulation over time. So it is a good question. We probably should have clarified that, but it is an accumulation of everybody who's left, who's still extant, who's still alive over time. So we see that growing in the population.
Okay, great.
So I guess what I was just
Oh,
wondering was,
Yeah,
it
Angela.
is the I'm interested in whether the rate or the proportion of the population that's exiting is increasing or staying the same. And that's what I'm interested in, right? It was
Yeah.
never zero people exiting, but it used to be pretty low, right?
Right.
And if you could call that a baseline. And so each year there's more, the curve's going up, but is it because more people proportionally are now deciding to exit, or are we just accumulating more people who have exited? That's why I was curious.
Yeah, it's a good question. So the rate of exiting has fluctuated over time. Interestingly, and there's been a little bit of play of this in kind of social media. I haven't seen any real kind of research come out about this. The last 3 years in the big national surveys, the percentage who are non-religious has kind of held steady, which would suggest that we're flatlined right now. Now, does that mean like we're done? I don't think that's the case, right? But we had a couple of periods where the rate was going up pretty dramatically. So during the 1990s and early 2000s, it was actually really high. Then it didn't level off, but it slowed a bit through the early 2010s. And now we've actually seen like the last 3 years, it's kind of leveled, at least in the US, right? What will happen in the future? I mean, our last chapter, we do talk about that a little bit. We project a little bit, we don't project way into the future. We go to 2040, right? Basically following Pew. So Pew did the same thing. We just added a couple of projections to theirs. We think that it's going to continue, but it's probably going to slow down, right? Is it possible that it increases? Sure, we don't really know, but it absolutely has fluctuated over time. Early 70s and 80s, it was a really low rate. It picked up in the 90s and early 2000s and has slowed down and even leveled in the last 3 years. So great question. And it's good to see you. It's been a while.
okay. All right. I'm gonna read a question from John Longhorst as well, and then I'll get to Abby. Okay. So John says, The boomer generation affected everything about Canadian and American life as that large group of people moved through the various life stages. What impact might the presence of that large group of people have on leaving religion today?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Jesse, you want me to tackle this?
Yeah, boomers specifically, how are they affecting all this? Yeah, take a shot.
Yeah, so it's a little bit tricky. So obviously, boomers, a lot of boomers are still alive, but Peter's point, I think, is a really good one about generational changes over time. So basically what we see, and it's going to be like one step removed from the boomers themselves. Boomers were more likely to kind of leave than the silent generation, generations before them. So that's absolutely true. But one of the big shifts that I think is important with boomers, and it wasn't all of them, but it was a shift that happened during the 1960s, was the growing level of autonomy that they granted their kids. So really, we're seeing the knock-on effects of that with their kids. So I would say almost one of the biggest effects of boomers really is that they decided to raise their kids in a different way, where it was less about obedience and more about autonomy and letting kids make their own decisions. And what that did is it allowed more kids to be like, well, I'm going to decide not to do this. And that's continuing to have knock-on effects in later generations. So that's something that started, I think, in that generation and then has just continued throughout time to where more and more families are basically allowing their kids to make their own decisions. And when you do that, the pretty clear consequences, kids are just not particularly interested in religion.
Yeah, and I think too, I'll just add to that. I think there's some evidence suggesting that there's better, quote, retention, right, among parents who raise their kids secular than the
Yeah.
religious who raise their kids religious. So that's affecting.
Yeah, that wasn't the case in the 1980s, but it's shifted, right? So as of the early 2000s, the non-religion is stickier. So people who are raised without religion are more likely to stay than people who are raised with religion. They're more likely to leave, and that shifted basically in the 1990s. So interesting questions. I hope we got to your question, John.
Okay, Abby, please go ahead.
Okay, right. Am I coming through okay with these headphones? Okay,
Yeah,
thank you very much. Thank you. Ryan, I gotta say, really my heart goes out to you and your family and your friends and your coworkers. It sounds like that hurricane is gonna be really scary. So
Yeah.
I hope everything goes well for you and for you know.
Appreciate it.
Okay. I just got one short technical question and then a more broad question. My short technical question is, you're talking about religion throughout. Your examples appear to be mainly Christian, so I'm asking, is the majority of your work here focused on Christianity, or are you actually looking at other religions? And if so, did you find differences between Christianity and other religions, or is it mainly Christianity? That's my little sort of just wanted to get that cleared up. But the one that's bigger is this idea of you're talking about generations, and as Ryan, I know you've been supporting very much my own presentations when I talked about baby boomers. That would be certainly my view, of course, is that they, as you said, kind of started this trend. But I kind of still cast around not for the demographic data, because we all know that, we've known that for a long time. But I'm wondering if you've had any insight into some grander, bigger social theory that might support this. As you said, generational change. It's a mechanism, and there's an observation about that. But through your work, do you look at any particular social theory that might be helpful to us to explain even why there is this generational change?
I can go ahead and start, and then I think Ryan can pick it up.
Yeah, go for it, Jesse.
Mind, Ryan. Just on the question about our sample, yes, it is true. Given the context that we're working with here, the majority, definitely not all, but the majority of our participants from the interview data are Christians, right? So in some sense, this really is a story about people leaving Christianity. However, we have a longish explanation at the end of the book, after the conclusion, I think, talking about generalizability, where we tackle the question of is this in any way at least suggestive of the process of religious exit generically, and not even just to monotheistic religions, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity, but is it applicable in any sense to just religion in general? We argue that it is, and although we don't have the empirical data that we work with throughout the body of the analysis in the book, Ryan offers a couple of, I think, useful hypotheticals, right? To just kind of follow through the logic of the way that we're presenting this, right? The push and pull factors, right? Taking into account the social, environmental conditions, demographic trends over time. The short answer is yes, we think that this is, if not in any statistical generalizable sense, but we think this is suggestive of the process of religious exit in general. Ryan, you maybe want to say something about the hypotheticals you gave there and then answer that bigger theoretical question.
I'm probably not going to remember all of the specific hypotheticals, but
yeah,
we certainly
you
do.
don't have to come up with the names and all that.
Yeah, but we did give some specific examples. Again, hypotheticals of like, okay, imagine that you've got two identical twins raised in, I don't know, someplace in Southeast Asia, and one of them ends up, getting to go off to college in England, and the other one stays local. Based on the propositions, and I'm going to come back to those propositions because I think that helps answer the second part of Abby's question. But based on our propositions, we would suggest that the person who goes off and gets higher education and is exposed to modern worldviews and different values and different perspectives, we would argue that they're more likely, despite the fact that they're coming from Southeast Asia, right, wherever it is, they're more likely to leave religion, to exit, to become more secular. So we do build in a bunch of propositions. And that's where we're saying, like, we can see how this could be generalizable. Jesse hit it, right? We don't have that empirical data in this book. We focus just on the US, and the US is predominantly Christian. So we think it could be generalizable, but like that's an open question. We're inviting people to follow up on the research and see if our propositions are generalizable to other contexts. But it is predominantly a formerly Christian or Christian population because of the nature of where we're studying. On that bigger question, I was going to pull them up. I won't show them here, but I was looking in the book. We came up with a list of formal propositions. So I'm not trying to pitch my last book, right? But I had a book come out last year on macro level secularization. And that one includes, very kind of detailed formalized theory where we give a lot of definitions, and then we put forward propositions of what's going to lead to macro level societal religious decline. I see this book at some level as kind of the micro companion to it. So the other one is like, hey, here's what's happening globally. Now let's look inside one specific context. And we give micro level propositions for the factors that we think are actually going to contribute to or increase the odds that people will leave religion. All of this, I would argue, is actually within a broader secularization framework. So do those specific propositions actually help push forward a theoretical argument? I think so. I don't know that I'm specifically getting to your question of like what's driving the generational change, but indirectly, I think those propositions are all lying at the heart of that generational decline, right? So yeah, the propositions are in there. And part of the reason why I've really pushed to formalize these propositions is I want other people to test them too. I think there's a bit of under-theorizing in this area. And until we have formal propositions, it's hard to be able to say who's right and who's wrong. So we're putting them out, in a sense, like sticking our necks out there and saying, hey, here's what we think it is. Show us whether we're wrong, right? And I invite that. I would love for us to be wrong, because every time we're wrong, we learn something new, and then we can change and get a better approximation of what's actually going on. So we do have that in there. There's kind of an underlying theoretical framework to the whole book, both the push and pull factors, but the propositions that lay on underneath that, on top of that, I don't know, they're in there, they're intermixed with it. I hope I got to your question, Abby. I think that was a little bit of an indirect way of answering it.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.
Yeah.
Right. I'm going to read one more question. Angela, I saw that you had some other questions, but I'm going to read a question by someone else just to make sure everyone, or as many people as possible, get to ask questions. So a question from Al. Hey, how far can we understand the macro factors in play by asking people directly? For example, how would we assess the importance of growing pluralism by asking people directly? Might this just not be mentioned, or might it surface in different ways? Might they just not be aware yet the issue has a major effect?
Great question, Al. I like the way you're thinking here. So I think this is partly how we've tried to address this in the book. So we have an introduction. The second chapter is about the demographics. Now, The nice thing about a demographic argument in particular is that it doesn't require us asking people whether this was important in their decision, right? Whether or not they're 25 years old is irrelevant to their justification or narrative that they built for why they left religion. So we can get some of those by just asking basic demographic questions, right? So I think that's all true. Some of the other factors that are trickier to get at, like social network, that one we do mention. We don't have really good empirical data on that. There's a little bit of data out there, but it's not, I don't think it's very robust. We draw on some of the stuff that exists, but there are ways, I think, like you're saying, to get at some of these questions of other forces that might be driving this that don't require us to just ask people. So one of the things that we talk about in the book, and we're pretty careful about this, is that we're not going to just rely exclusively on the narratives that people construct to say this is why I left religion. Yeah, that's a big part of what we've got going on in the book, but it's not the only thing that we wrestle with in the book. We talk about other social forces. And in fact, there's a lot of discussion of shifting context and other social forces that play into this. And all of that, I think, is getting at your point, which is like, yeah, people are going to tell us stories, but how much can we really trust the stories that people tell? And we're skeptical, but not like dismissive, right? So we're skeptical, but not dismissive. We accept what they're saying, but recognize that there's a whole other social context that's playing into this. Jesse, did I do okay
Yeah,
on
and
that?
yeah, that's great. I want to mention too that we kind of have a time horizon that we're looking at here. We haven't mentioned at all one of our other kind of theoretical elements here. We have a three-part pathways model where we look at, we've got the religiously indifferent on one end of the continuum and secular activists on the other end. And we've got what we call religious secular liminality kind of in between. And the advantage of this is that, yes, we're still relying on the narratives that people share and explaining why they've left religion. But we have this typology, not to say that there are specific types of people, right? There's not just like this is a religiously indifferent person, here's a secular activist. Although you could do that because we've got evidence from the interviews. But what we argue here is that, again, the interviews go back to 2008 and people sharing their stories way before then, right? We argue that there's these pathways actually can be applicable to any one individual depending on where they are in the life course, right? And then there's some people that undergo this trajectory such that the endpoint might be religious indifference, but they started out with a hard break from religion as going, being a secular activist, right? And then sort of, their interests change, the context change, their motives change, and they end up in a different spot than they were at the beginning. So another thing just we hadn't really mentioned here is the role of the life course, kind of the life course perspective that we kind of layered on to the narratives of our participants. I think that helps, flesh out a little bit more of the context. Again, we do understand that stories people share, they're post hoc rationalizations of what they've done in some sense, right? But we think we've got enough of the context, especially with the quantitative data that we're relying on, to draw some inferences, extract some inferences out of our participants' quotes that they didn't, that might just be implicit, right? That we're not relying specifically on all the claims that they make. We read between the lines a little bit and draw some broader conclusions.
Okay, Barathi, do you want to go ahead very quickly to ask the last question?
All right. Thank you, Jesse and Ryan. I hope you can hear me. Yeah. So my question is regarding, the models that you have, spoken about in this particular work. So initially, earlier, when we speak about religion and non-religion, there was a conflict model, and then it quickly shifted to market model, where the relationship between religion and secular groups are conceptualized in terms of the relationship between clients and firms. And now you have a particularly different migration model. Why did you choose migration model, and how does migration model answer to the previous models employed in describing the relationship between religion and non-religion, how they operate and get more people to come to other path in this particular sense? So this is one question. And one more other short question is, you mentioned about socio-political causes. Can you also speak a little bit more about the economic class and status of people who are converting in a larger sense? And finally, sorry, can you also speak about, the effect of new atheists here? Thank you. Sorry.
A lot of questions. Yeah, so I may be able to answer one of those very quickly. Social class does not seem to have any bearing on this, which is kind of nice. So we can very quickly just say, like, that's not a huge issue. We talk about that in the book. Knowing somebody's social class explains basically none of the variation in who's going to leave. And that's been the case for a very long time. On the push-pull and how that relates to like conflict and market theories and all of these things, one of the things that like, it's hard to explain in a very short presentation, I think we do a better job in the book, is we wrestle with the fact that no single individual is going to be comparable to somebody else in terms of why they're leaving religion. So everybody's going to have like their own reason, and it's tricky. So it's hard to say like, oh, person X left because of this, and that also applies to person Y through Q, right? Like it's just not the way that this works. And that's why I think the push-pull framework is actually a better framework than say like a conflict theory framework or market theory framework, is they kind of assume universal factors, and we're actually not doing that. We're saying for any one individual, it's going to be something very specific, and that's what's going to leave. That's what's going to lead them to leave. So certain forces increase the odds that somebody is going to leave, but how those play out is at the individual level. And that's what makes it really, really hard. I mean, I basically admit in here that my doctoral dissertation was a big, complicated statistical model trying to predict who's going to leave. And the amount of variation that I could explain was really, really bad because every individual is unique, and what drives them out is really, really difficult to explain. And that's why we didn't ultimately put together a big statistical model, is because it kind of uses generalizable effects to try and explain individual behavior. And it turns out that's just not how people work, right? So people work on functional different levels. Jesse, how did I do? And I know we're over time.
No, that's great. I don't really have anything to add there.
Okay. Nathan, what do we think?
Okay. All right. I think we'll leave it there. I know there's some questions we didn't get to, unfortunately, but hopefully you can either pick up the book and get your answers there, or contact the authors directly. I'm just gonna drop some links in the chat we've got an upcoming event next month. This is it's kind of a new series we're doing, kind of a collaboration between historians and social scientists about particular issues. This one happening next month is about death and dying. So it's going to be a conversation between historians and social scientists on that topic. I also included a link to the NCF's podcast. If you haven't had a chance to listen to it yet, make sure you do and share it with your friends. And I've also included a link to the NCF mailing list in case you're not on the list and you want to get updates about our upcoming events and new research and so on. Please sign up. Otherwise, I'd just like to thank Ryan and Jesse for the really interesting presentation and for the discussion afterward, and everyone for coming and for all your questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone. That was great. Lots of good questions.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It was fun. Thank you.